She was just a mother, buying ice cream with her daughter, until two police officers asked her to prove she hadn't kidnapped her own child, in front of strangers, in front of her daughter, in a place where families are supposed to feel safe. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The day had begun like any other sunlight spilling through the wide arched windows of the LeClaire Creamery in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. A cool breeze whispered in from the harbor, carrying with it the scent of salt and summer. Inside the boutique ice cream parlor, laughter bounced off marble counters and pastel walls. Polished spoons clinked against glass dishes, and soft jazz hummed beneath the gentle roar of conversation. But in the space of a single sentence, all of that serenity would be shattered. "Ma'am, please step away from the child." Imani Hill blinked. She had been leaning down to wipe a smudge of strawberry ice cream from her daughter Amara's chin. 6-year-old legs swinging happily from the velvet bench. Amara looked up, eyes wide, confused. The cone in her hand began to melt faster than her thoughts could keep up. "Excuse me." Imani's voice was calm, but the air had changed. Gone was the warmth. In its place was a cold, institutional presence. 2 uniformed officers stood before her, their hands hovering too close to their belts. "We received a report of a possible abduction," said the taller officer, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His eyes flicked to Amara and then back to Imani. "We need to verify your relationship to the girl." Time stopped. The room fell silent, save for the mechanical whirl of the espresso machine. A few heads turned. A phone was lifted. Somewhere in the corner, a woman with platinum hair and oversized sunglasses lowered her iPhone and sipped her latte with practiced detachment. Amara reached for her mother's hand. "Mommy, what's happening?" Imani crouched instinctively, folding her arms around her daughter. "You're okay, baby," she whispered, but her mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. Not again. Not here. This wasn't the first time. The first time had been in a department store in Atlanta when Amara was a toddler and Imani had knelt to tie her shoelaces. A store clerk had hovered too long, asked too many questions. The second time had been at the pediatrician's office. A new nurse, unsure of the family resemblance, had hesitated before allowing Imani to sign consent forms. This time, though, felt different. This time, there were badges. The younger officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. We just need identification." Imani stood slowly, her spine straight as steel. She reached into her purse with deliberate precision, the kind of movement taught through generations of unspoken survival. "My name is Imani Hill. This is my daughter, Amara Hill. I have her birth certificate in my glove compartment if you'd like to escort me to my car." The officer didn't move. Behind them, murmurs began to rise. People weren't sure what they were watching yet, but they were watching. That much was certain. And then, from across the room, "I'm telling you, something felt off. That child doesn't look like her." The voice came from the woman with the sunglasses. She was speaking to no one in particular, but loudly enough to be heard. "I was being cautious. Human trafficking is everywhere these days." Imani inhaled slowly, then exhaled. The familiar taste of humiliation, metallic and bitter, rose in her throat. It didn't matter that Amara had her eyes, her dimples, her laugh. It didn't matter that Imani had carried her for 9 months, sung to her, through fevers taught her to write her name. What mattered apparently was that Amara's skin was fairer, her curls looser. What mattered was what people chose to see and what they refused to believe. "I'm her mother," Imani said, again this time more forcefully. "And unless you have evidence of a crime, I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing here." The older officer hesitated. The younger one looked away. The silence stretched, and in that silence, the question hung heavy, in the air unspoken but undeniable. What does a mother look like? Is it skin color? Hair texture, matching eyes? Is it the way she holds her child? Or the way she speaks in public? Or is it something deeper? Something the world still hasn't learned how to see? Behind the counter, a barista stopped, pretending not to listen. A family near the window stood up, unsure whether to leave or get involved. Someone started recording. Someone else whispered, "She looks terrified." Imani was terrified, not for herself, but for what this moment might plant in Amara's memory. How many more times would her daughter be asked to prove she belonged, to explain her family, to navigate a world that questioned her very foundation? And then Amara said almost inaudibly, "Are they taking me away, Mommy?" That was the moment the air shifted again. Not because of the police, not because of the crowd, but because Imani refused to let this be just another quiet wound. She stepped forward. "If you're going to arrest me, do it now. But know this, you will be on camera, you will be held accountable, and you will answer to my attorney and to my daughter. Because she will remember this day for the rest of her life." The room was no longer silent. It was charged, electric. People leaned forward. A man spoke up from the back. "This is wrong. I've seen them here before. They're always together." Someone else nodded. "They're regulars. Everyone knows that." The officers hesitated. The illusion of authority flickered. For a moment, even the woman with the sunglasses seemed unsure. It took only seconds, but everything had changed. The crowd, once passive, had begun to speak. The system, once unchallenged, was now being watched. And Imani, once just another mother buying ice cream, had become something else entirely. The woman they hadn't seen until they feared her. The mother they doubted until she made them look again. The truth they weren't ready for. And this was only the beginning. Officer Jameson Parker had been on the force for over 16 years, long enough to tell when a situation was routine and when it wasn't. But as he stood in front of the upscale Seattle ice cream parlor, watching a black woman kneeling before a pale-skinned child with trembling hands, he felt something wasn't adding up. Not in the way the 911 caller had described it, and certainly not in the way his training had prepared him to understand it. Inside, the air was thick, not with tension alone, but with shame. That kind of cold, crawling shame that comes when you realize too late that you may be playing the wrong role in the wrong story. "We're just following up on a report," Parker had said when he first entered. His tone, neutral, professional, at least that was what he told himself. But already, as he looked into the woman's face, Aria Thomas, she'd said, Dr. Aria Thomas, the familiar discomfort of realization had started to creep in. Her face didn't show fear. It showed something heavier, practiced resilience. It was Officer Nina Clark, new to the department and fresh out of the academy, who held the clipboard, the procedural checklist trembling slightly in her grasp. She watched as Arya produced ID after ID, her daughter's school pass, medical cards, even a digital copy of a birth certificate stored neatly on her phone. Everything matched. And yet, the unease didn't leave the room. Outside, curious onlookers had begun to gather. Some peered through the glass. A few filmed pretending to scroll their phones, lenses pointed like silent accusations. The cafe had grown quiet, save for the espresso machine's soft hiss and the strained breathing of a child trying to understand why her ice cream was melting on the table untouched. "Mommy, are you in trouble?" little Ava asked again, her eyes full of confusion and hurt. "No, baby," Arya whispered gently, brushing a hand through her curls. "Mommy's just answering some questions." But inside, Arya was unraveling. Not with panic, but with exhaustion. She knew what this was. She'd lived it too many times in too many forms. At the department store, where the security guard followed her aisle to aisle. At the elementary school, where a substitute had once refused to release Ava without verifying paperwork. At the pediatrician's office, where she was mistaken again for a babysitter. And now here, under the sterile glow of cafe lights, accused once more of not belonging with the child who shared her laugh, her stubbornness, her love of vanilla bean ice cream. "Why are we still here?" she asked quietly, her voice calm but edged with steel. Officer Parker paused. The checklist had no more boxes to tick, no inconsistencies, no red flags, no evidence of wrongdoing. Yet here he was, holding the weight of a call made by a woman who'd vanished before she could be questioned. "We're just being thorough," he replied, not meeting Arya's gaze. "Are you?" she said, stepping forward, now, voice sharper. "Or are you just trying to make sure the woman who looks like me can prove she belongs to a child who looks like her father?" Clark flinched at the bluntness of it, but didn't argue. "You don't have to say it," Arya added. "You don't have to admit what you're thinking. The world does that for you. Every time it tells me to carry birth certificates to the grocery store. Every time it asks me to prove my motherhood with paperwork instead of presents." Ava had stopped crying now. She was watching her mother, really watching something shifting in her small face. Awareness, not yet named, but forming. Officer Parker ran a hand over his jaw. "We're just doing our job," he said again. But it came out hollow this time. "No," Arya said. "You're following a protocol written by people who never imagined families like mine. And instead of questioning it, you let it question us." For a moment, no one spoke. Even the cafe's baristas, who had tried to act normal through the confrontation, had gone still. Clark glanced at Parker, then back at Arya. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know that doesn't fix anything. But I am." And it was in that moment, soft, honest, deeply uncomfortable, that the difference between protocol and prejudice came into sharp relief. Protocol was the process. Prejudice was why the process had been invoked in the first place. As the officers prepared to leave, Parker turned back one last time. "You said your husband was coming." "He is," Arya replied. "But you've already seen everything you need. The problem isn't what you didn't see. It's what you expected not to." Outside, the wind had picked up. The crowd had begun to disperse, some nodding quietly in Arya's direction, others slipping away with eyes downcast. No one said a word to her face. They didn't need to. Their silence said enough. 10 minutes later, Daniel Thomas arrived. Suit jacket, still on tie, loosened panic in his eyes, until he saw Ava safely tucked beneath Arya's arm. When he learned what had happened, his reaction was fury, but not loud, not reckless. Just a quiet, seething rage, like the kind Arya had carried for years. He didn't yell. He documented everything. And when he sat down beside his wife, he said, "We're not letting this go." Arya nodded, her gaze fixed on Ava's small hands still holding the melted cone. "We never do." And as the sun dipped lower behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the glass windows of the cafe, it became clear that this story wasn't over. The officers had left, the crowd had vanished, but the question remained unspoken, yet echoing through every heart that witnessed it. How many times must a mother prove she belongs to her child, and how many more times will protocol be used to excuse what prejudice sets in motion? The next morning, Arya stood in her kitchen, staring into the steam rising from a chipped ceramic mug. Her hands wrapped tightly around the warmth, though she felt anything but comforted. The events from the day before lingered like smoke unseen, but suffocating. Ava was still asleep in the next room, curled beside her favorite stuffed rabbit, blissfully unaware of how the world had shifted beneath her mother's feet. But Arya couldn't sleep, couldn't forget. Not because of what had happened, but because of how familiar it all felt. This wasn't the first time she'd been questioned for loving her own child. It wasn't even the 10th. It was just the most public. Daniel found her still standing there half an hour later, his voice breaking the stillness. "You okay?" "No," she said softly then after a pause. "But I'm used to it." Daniel leaned on the counter beside her, silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that ignored. It was the kind that knew. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't offer platitudes. He just waited. And finally, she said, "I'm tired of defending my right to be a mother. I'm tired of pretending that this doesn't chip away at something every time it happens." He nodded. So we stopped pretending. That afternoon, Arya did something she hadn't done in years. She logged into a long dormant blog she had started in graduate school, a space where she used to reflect on her work in child psychology and her dreams for the family she hoped to build. The last post was dated 7 years ago, just before Ava was born. She stared at the blinking cursor, the weight of 1,000 words resting on her shoulders, and then she began to type. She didn't write about race statistics or policy failures. She wrote about Ava, about what it felt like to watch her daughter's face crumble with confusion as 2 uniformed officers stood between them. About the quiet war mothers like her fought each day, not in courtrooms or rallies, but in schools, stores, doctors' offices, and sidewalks. She wrote about the heartbreak of being questioned and the exhaustion of always having to respond with grace. And then she hit publish. By evening, the post had been shared over 200,000 times. It wasn't the viral video that had gone around, though people had seen that too. It was Arya's voice that broke through, the calm, composed dignity in her words. The way she described not just the pain of what had happened, but the long legacy behind it. She wasn't angry. She was honest. And in a world where truth often comes wrapped in outrage, her clarity was piercing. Former students wrote to her, colleagues, strangers, mothers of biracial children who had experienced the same shame in quiet corners of their lives, fathers who admitted they had never considered how different it felt to move through the world in Arya's skin, even with the same last name as their children. Some letters came from teachers, others from teenagers. But one stood out, a message from a young woman who wrote, "You were my high school counselor. You told me that silence doesn't mean I don't have a story. Today, you proved that to the world. Legacy doesn't always show up in headlines. Sometimes it appears in inboxes, folded notes, late-night texts, in the hearts of people who remember the way you showed up for them, even when you were breaking. The following week, Aria received a call from the local NPR affiliate. They wanted to do a segment, not about the incident, but about what it revealed. She agreed on one condition, that they also feature other voices, other mothers, other families, other stories. She didn't want to be the face of trauma. She wanted to open a door, so she sat in a quiet studio with headphones over her ears. And when the interviewer asked Dr. Thomas, "What made you decide to speak publicly now?" she answered with a voice steady as stone. Because staying silent never protected us. It just allowed others to speak for us. And I won't let my daughter grow up thinking that silence is the cost of survival. The interview aired across the state. Listeners called in with tears in their voices. A retired teacher said she'd never thought about how her questions about real parents landed. A foster parent shared a story of nearly losing custody because a neighbor didn't believe the kids were hers. An older man said simply, "I've never cried listening to the radio before. But now I understand what I didn't see." Legacy began to take shape in unexpected ways. A nearby elementary school invited Aria to speak. A university asked her to consult on implicit bias training. Parents organized a reading circle where children's books about mixed families became weekly stories. Her inbox filled with opportunities, but Aria stayed grounded. She didn't want to become a symbol. She wanted to be a seed. And then came the unexpected. A letter from the woman who had called the police. Anonymous at first, it arrived in an unmarked envelope. Inside were 10 handwritten lines. Apologizing, not explaining, not defending, just apologizing. "I saw something that didn't fit my idea of family," it said, "and I acted. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Aria sat with the letter for hours. She didn't know if it was sincere. She didn't know if the woman would ever show her face again. But she knew this legacy isn't built on whether people apologize. It's built on whether we choose to tell the truth, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. And her truth, her family's truth, had broken the silence. That night, after Ava fell asleep, Aria sat beside Daniel on the porch. The stars were faint above the city haze, but they were there. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked. He squeezed her hand. "It already has." Because somewhere, a mother was reading her blog and feeling less alone. Somewhere, a child was being taught that families don't all look the same. Somewhere, an officer was rethinking protocol. And somewhere, a woman who had once made a devastating call was beginning to ask herself why. Legacy doesn't wait for permission. It begins the moment silence is broken. And Aria Thomas had finally spoken. Weeks passed, but the weight of that day in the ice cream parlor didn't fade. It evolved. Aria Thomas found herself stepping into spaces she hadn't planned to enter, not as a response to outrage, but as a continuation of something deeper, something ancestral, a purpose stirred by generations before her. She began to speak, not just for herself, not for Ava alone, but for every family that had ever been questioned, examined, or invalidated by strangers who couldn't comprehend that love could look different than what they were used to. It started with a message from a school principal in Tacoma. "We saw your interview. Would you consider speaking at our next faculty seminar on implicit bias and family identity. Aria didn't hesitate. She packed a few slides, some data, and one picture, just one. It was a candid snapshot of Ava asleep across her chest, 5 years ago, limbs tangled in trust. She opened her talk with that image and said, "Before we talk about race or policy or training modules, can we agree this is what family looks like?" The room went still, and that stillness, Aria had learned, was often the beginning of listening. From there, the invitations grew. Churches, schools, parenting groups, foster networks. Some asked her to speak. Others just wanted her to show up to share space to witness. Aria began carrying a small journal wherever she went, filling its pages with the voices of others, stories of adopted children being asked where their real parents were, of Black fathers told to prove they weren't kidnapping, their kids, of Asian mothers being mistaken for nannies, of gay parents being asked who the actual mom was. There was pain in every page, but also power. A growing chorus that refused to be quiet anymore. She called the project The Shades of Family. It was more than a name. It was a recognition that family exists on a spectrum the world has barely begun to understand, not just racially, but emotionally, economically, structurally. She partnered with a local photographer who helped her document portraits of families with complex bonds, blended multiracial, fostered chosen. They launched a traveling exhibit that toured community centers and libraries. Each portrait was paired with a handwritten note from the family, a reflection on how they defined themselves beyond assumptions. At a library opening in Spokane, an older woman pulled Aria aside. She wore a floral scarf and carried a cane with grace. "My husband was white," she said softly. "He died before our kids were old enough to remember his voice. I raised them alone, and people used to ask all the time where their father was, why they didn't look like me. I thought it would never change. But watching you speak, I finally felt seen." Those moments grounded Aria more than headlines or shares. They reminded her that what she was doing wasn't just timely, it was timeless. One afternoon, while picking Ava up from school, Aria found a small drawing folded into her daughter's backpack. Crayon lines showed two stick figures, one brown, one pale. Above them, in crooked handwriting, it read, "This is my family. You don't have to match to love each other." Aria stared at it, heart aching in a way only pride could ache. "Did you draw this?" she asked as Ava buckled herself into the back seat. "No," Ava said. "My friend Molly did. She said she thought about what you told us last week in class." Aria had almost forgotten she'd spoken to Ava's class that day. It was meant to be a light-hearted talk about kindness, but somewhere along the way, she'd answered a child's question. Why don't you and your daughter look alike, with honesty, not deflection? Maybe that was all it took. One honest moment in a room full of 6-year-olds. As her work continued, Aria began collaborating with advocacy groups. She developed a curriculum for teachers to better recognize how seemingly innocent questions could harm children's understanding of their families. She helped pediatric clinics update their intake processes to better acknowledge diverse family dynamics. She worked with media teams on inclusive children's books and educational programs. But she never let the work overshadow what mattered most. Some days she logged off social media. Some days she didn't answer emails. Some days she let herself be just a mother sitting beside her daughter with coloring books and cereal bowls and giggles over nothing. Because that was the heart of it, the reason for all of it. Daniel stayed steady through it all, co-architect of their life, cheerleader, challenger, protector. He never tried to take the spotlight, but his presence was woven through every victory. When Arya doubted whether she was saying too much, he reminded her, "You're not just speaking for you. You're making space for the people who don't have the words yet." One night, after Ava had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Arya sat scrolling through her Shades of Family inbox. A message caught her eye from a social worker in Mississippi. "I've shared your story with every foster family on my caseload. I can't tell you how many doors it opened. Kids who didn't know how to ask the questions, parents who didn't know how to answer them. Thank you." She closed her eyes, breathed in, then out. The next morning, she drove to the cafe where everything had begun. It was a warm day, the scent of spring easing into the air. She ordered 2 cones vanilla for Ava mint chocolate for herself and sat at the same table near the window. No officers came, no suspicious glances, just ice cream and her daughter giggling over melted drips. Ava looked up between bites. "Mommy, are we famous now?" Arya smiled. "No, baby, we're just visible." And in a world that had tried so long to erase or question what didn't fit its mold, visibility, true, radiant, unapologetic visibility was its own quiet revolution. Years from now, people might not remember the exact name of the cafe, the brand of Ava's ice cream, or even the woman who dialed 911 with misplaced certainty. But they would remember what came after. What began with a mother forced to defend her family over dessert became a catalyst that rippled far beyond a single summer afternoon. Arya Thomas never set out to change systems. Her only goal that day was to give her daughter a simple moment of joy. But life had different plans, and Arya met them not with fury, but with clarity. She understood that her story was never just hers. It belonged to every parent who'd been mistaken for the help, every child who saw confusion in the eyes of others when they called out "Mom," every stranger who had dared to question love simply because it didn't look the way they expected. Within a year, the Shades of Family initiative had grown into a national network. Schools invited her to train staff. Medical offices implemented identity sensitivity protocols. Children's publishers reached out to her to co-author a book on modern families. Ava's drawing, the one that read, "You don't have to match to love each other," became the cover. But the most powerful changes didn't happen on stages or in front of cameras. They happened quietly in the softened tone of a teacher who once questioned, now asking with care. In a neighbor who used to stare, now waving at Arya and Ava as they played in the yard. In a little girl at a grocery store who tugged at her mother's sleeve and said, "That family looks like ours." Daniel, steadfast and steady, watched his wife reshape the conversation one story at a time. He joked that it had taken a scoop of vanilla to break the silence of a country still uncomfortable with difference. But he also knew the truth. It wasn't the ice cream. It was the woman who chose to speak when others would have walked away. Ava, too, was changing. She asked better questions. She held her head higher. She began to understand that her mother's calm wasn't weakness. It was resistance, refined into wisdom. Arya stood once more in front of a crowd, this time at a national education summit. She wasn't a guest speaker. She was the keynote. Some people think change starts with movements or elections or policies, she said. But sometimes it starts with a misunderstanding, a mistake, a moment that reveals how fragile our assumptions really are. We can't control what people see when they look at us, but we can choose what we show them when they do. She stepped back from the podium, and the applause was not explosive, but sustained. It was the sound of recognition, of gratitude, of impact, because from ice cream came understanding, and from that came everything else. Aurea Thomas never intended to become a symbol. She was a mother, a professional, a woman who on a warm afternoon in Venice Beach, California, simply wanted to share a moment of sweetness with her daughter Ava. But when a stranger's suspicion collided with a system ready to respond more to skin tone than truth, that ordinary moment was transformed into something unforgettable. What followed was more than a confrontation. It was an unmasking of the quiet ways racism persists in everyday places. In an ice cream shop, where a mother was mistaken for a kidnapper. In the protocol that presumed danger instead of dignity. In the stares that whispered judgment before a single word was spoken. Yet what made Aria's story extraordinary was not just what happened to her, but how she responded. She met the moment with strength, not rage, with clarity, not collapse. She chose not only to defend herself, but to elevate the experience into something larger. She didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for the thousands of families who look different from what society expects and are made to feel like they must constantly prove their love. She turned the sting of injustice into the seed of awareness. And as word of her story spread, so too did a new understanding. This wasn't just a one-off incident. It was a mirror. And it asked all of us, how many assumptions have we made without realizing it? How many moments have we watched in silence because it didn't happen to us? How many people, like Aria, have been forced to carry burdens that no one sees? The lesson we draw from Aria's journey is both powerful and personal. Love doesn't have to explain itself. Family isn't bound by resemblance. An identity should never be questioned based on someone else's discomfort. Her story reminds us that the most dangerous form of prejudice is often the one that hides behind the guise of concern. That suspicion, when rooted in bias, becomes a weapon even when wielded with a polite smile. So how do we apply this to our lives today? We start by noticing, by interrupting our own assumptions, by stepping in even when it feels uncomfortable, by teaching our children that love looks many ways. We educate ourselves, challenge what we've been taught, and open space for stories that haven't yet been told. And perhaps most importantly, we listen, truly listen, to those whose lives are shaped daily by being misunderstood. Because someone like Aria shouldn't have to go viral to be believed. She should be respected simply for showing up with her daughter, her truth, and her quiet grace. If this story moved, you challenged you, or opened your eyes, we ask you to join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel. Share this video. Leave a comment about how it made you feel. Your support helps us bring more stories like Aria's to life stories that don't just inform, but transform. Let's make sure voices like hers are never silenced again.